Hi, welcome to this video where we are looking at China becoming a communist nation as one of the crises of the Cold War. Remember that our syllabus actually lists this as a particular crisis. It does take place in 1949, but let's go back and get a little bit of background so we can understand a bit more about the impact that this particular event has on the development of the Cold War. Now, China, of course, had actually been in civil war for quite some time. For our purposes, I'll introduce you on the left to Chiang Kai-shek, who was at the time the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party called the Kuomintang. He'd been the leader since the sort of about 1923 when Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the party, had died. And on the right, I introduce you there to a very young Mao Zedong, who was, by the end of this period, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I hasten to add, he was not the only leading communist, but certainly during this period he emerges as the leader. Now, these groups, while they had cooperated very early in modern China's history, by 1927, civil war had broken out in China between these two key forces. If we take a look at this map, you can see the pink on the map is the region really that was under the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party's control from about 1928 through to 1937. The orange sections on the map were actually controlled by warlords. Most of them were, cooperating with the Kuomintang, but it gives you a sense of how chaotic and difficult and complex, really, China was at the time. The Communist Party, to begin with, actually had a base down here in the southeast of China, but by 1934 was certainly under a huge amount of pressure from the Kuomintang troops. And you can see the red line here gives an indication of an event called the Long March. When I say event, it's a march that takes place over more than a year, and the communist troops basically move and end up establishing a new base for themselves further here in the north, and certainly that takes place by 1934, and this is the point where we see Mao emerging as a much stronger leader of the Communist Party. The other colour to really take note of on this map is the dark orangey reddy colour, and this is really an indication of what's about to happen in China, because the Japanese forces have been expanding, and what you see on this map is the Japanese occupation of the northern part of China here, Manchuria. They actually established a whole new place that they called Manchukuo, with a puppet emperor under Japanese control. So that was already in place by 1933. And unfortunately for the Chinese, the Japanese expansion continued. From 1937, we see the Japanese expanding further south, and this map shows you all the pink areas are the Japanese areas of occupation by 1940. The Kuomintang with the nationalist government was trying to hang on, and there were still communist forces at play. And during this period from 1937 through World War II to the end of 1945, the communists and the nationalists, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, kind of had a bit of a truce. I wouldn't say they're exactly friendly, but they had a truce while they both tried to fight off the Japanese occupation. One of the things to understand during World War II is that China, particularly the nationalist government of China under Chiang Kai-shek, was seen as the Americans and the British as an ally. This is an interesting poster here from 1942. It's a US propaganda poster. It's listing all of those who are fighting together for freedom. And we can see here in this corner is the Chinese nationalist flag. On the top row here, it's interesting, these four at the top end up being members of the Security Council together with France, which of course by 1942 was occupied by the Germans. It wasn't exactly fighting for freedom. Well, it was behind the lines, but is not listed on this poster. So China was seen as an ally and a friend by the capitalist governments. Here's another US poster from World War II, really showing us that the Americans wanted to be seen as friends of the Chinese nationalist government. And in the middle here, Sun Yat-sen was the founder of that nationalist system, although Chiang Kai-shek was in charge by this stage. So China was seen really as, while it had been in a lot of chaos, it was not well industrialized, but it was massive, and it was seen by the capitalists as a potential friendly giant for them moving forward. The interesting thing, though, is that the Soviets didn't necessarily see the Communist Party in China as something that they needed to ally with. And one of the reasons for this is that this is Mao Zedong here, shown here and here. His brand of communism or socialism was a little bit different to that of Stalin and the Soviets. As, of course, I'm sure you remember, the Soviet Revolution, the original Bolshevik Revolution, based on a Marxist revolution by the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. But Mao really depended upon peasant support for his style of socialism. And he very much advocated giving away land to the peasants as the basis for attracting support to Chinese socialism. Stalin had kind of dismissed Mao's form of socialism as something that probably wouldn't work. And you may even remember that at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, we can see Stalin here with Truman and Clement Attlee from Britain. In 1945, Stalin had actually agreed that he would not support the he would not support the Communist Party in China, and instead he pledged to support the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. That's what he said in 1945. What did he get in return? He got agreement that he could invade the north of China and take a nice slice for itself at the end of the war. And this is exactly what took place in 1945 when the Soviets did declare war on the Japanese. You can see from this map, they launch into the north of China, take control of Manchuria, and importantly for later on, for us to know, also moving in here to the Korean Peninsula. So you can see this map here, which shows us the Japanese occupation again in the dark pink, but you can see the lined areas are these areas where there was a lot of communist forces at play at the end of World War II. And so the communists had quite a significant control here in the north, and further north, of course, the Soviet forces had moved in. And the Kuomintang, the nationalists, were trying to take over control of the rest of China and taking, the Japanese surrender. And by 1946, we had an outbreak of civil war again between the communists and the Kuomintang. As 1946 wears on and we move into 1947, the Americans, of course, are very keen to make sure that Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists hang on to power. And after the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan are announced, a lot of money is spent going into the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, in China. In the north, Stalin didn't really provide a lot of support to Mao. The most that they did do is that as they took control of the Japanese military in the north, they allowed certain tanks and ammunition to fall into the hands of the Chinese communists. But other than that, Mao was not provided any support by the Soviets. Despite this, while we have the initial conflict here in the north between the communists and the Kuomintang, you can see here that by 1949, the communists have really out-strategized, and militarily they've beaten the Kuomintang, who were forced to evacuate the Chinese mainland and set up a new base at Taiwan, which is a place which is still in dispute between the communist Chinese and those who have inherited the nationalist government from the Kuomintang. So on the 1st of October, with complete control of the mainland, Mao Zedong announces the establishment of the People's Republic of China. So 1949, 1st of October 1949, we have a communist China in place. Now, we've already said that Mao had not really received any support from Stalin during this period of time, but it's now 1949, the Cold War is on for all. And so Stalin is very happy, very pleased, and sets about establishing a friendship of a kind between China and the Soviet Union. Don't they look happy here? And we have, in 1950, for example, a Sino-Soviet treaty is established. It's a treaty of alliance, friendship, and mutual assistance. It includes money from the Soviets. It includes technological support and expertise coming from China, coming from the Soviet Union into China. So what then is the impact of China becoming communist? How does this crisis impact on the development of the Cold War? Well, it wasn't created by the Cold War. It's a much deeper, longer standing conflict in China itself that led to this event. But the event itself does go on to have an impact on the Cold War. For example, if you take a look at this map on the left and have a sense, if you're the Americans sitting there thinking about, their policy of containing the spread of communism, suddenly you've got a massive increase in the communist world. Quarter of the world's population is from China, and that is a massive blow to the American ideal of containing the spread of communism. Certainly the Americans had hoped to have that friendly capitalist giant in Asia, and they basically refused to acknowledge the new communist government. Until 1971, the Communist Party of China was not acknowledged as the new Chinese government and was not able to take its place on the United Nations. Certainly it does now seem to create a massive communist bloc in Asia. It's not quite as clear and as beautifully allied as the Americans might have thought, and that's something we'll go on to explore a little bit later as the Cold War progresses, that the Chinese and the Soviets were not always the closest of friends. But in 1949, this is a huge blow to the Americans. And it's clear now that the Cold War is a global phenomenon. This is not just something happening over in Europe anymore, but the spread of communism is global. And this leads the Americans really to have a rethink about their foreign policy. And in another video, we'll take a look at a particular document called NSC 68, which leads the Americans to develop and to extend their policy of containment, but in a much more aggressive way. And this sets up a much more aggressive America and a much more aggressive American foreign policy for the remainder of the Cold War. So again, an event that wasn't caused by the Cold War, but is certainly a very important part of the Cold War and does have a significant impact on how the Cold War now develops and how those relationships between the USA and the Soviet Union continue to develop.